in Job 1 and 2, I don't think we necessarily see this Satan accuser adversary figure as necessarily evil.
Maybe they're the same context, maybe they're talking about the same thing, and then in that case we could make the argument that the devil is Satan, the devil being in charge of the sons of God.
Do take more of the supernatural view. It's just as modernists, we try to downplay all the supernatural so much.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with Matt Mouzakis of Expedition 44. We're going to be talking about the devil. We're going to talk about Satan. Is your view of Satan actually biblical? We're going to talk about that today. How are you doing today, Matt?
Hey, great. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to chatting with you. Um, it's been great.
Awesome.
Kind of getting to know you on the side, and I'm excited to talk about the devil.
Oh, yes. Got my red shirt on today. We're allowed to forgot my horns, but next time. Yeah, can you give us a little bit about your background, education, current job, all that?
Yeah, like you said, my name is Matt. I am a pastor, worship pastor. So I lead the music and do a bunch of discipleship groups and stuff at my church here in Wisconsin. I've been married to my wife, Audrey, for 16 years. We have 4 kids. Um, I got my bachelor's in biblical studies from Trinity Theological Seminary and my master's from there in biblical studies and ancient languages. And I'm working on my doctorate degree at Covenant Theological Seminary, not the Reformed one in St. Louis, but the one in North Carolina. I believe you had Dr. Ryan on shortly ago, and he's my doctoral supervisor, actually. So, working on a degree in New Testament there, doctorate there. So, just getting to kind of the middle to end of my dissertation and hopefully be able to finish that up soon. And like you said, I am one of the co-hosts for Expedition 44. We're a biblical studies and theology podcast, and just kind of geared towards digging into the Bible and encouraging people to grow as deeper disciples of Jesus.
Amen. Yeah, and definitely everyone encourage people to check out your channel. A lot bigger than mine, but obviously much really good content. Anyways, okay,
Oh, thanks.
so we're talking about Satan today. Can you give us just the kind of the origin of where that came from in Greek and how that's just a little bit different than the word in Hebrew?
Yeah, so you got satanos, which is the Greek word for that's transliterated as Satan, which actually comes as a transliteration of the Hebrew. So the Hebrew word hasatan, which is accuser or adversary, and so that is the word that we get for Satan. So the Greek is a transliteration of a Hebrew word that's transliterated.
Gotcha. And you mentioned the adversary. So can you give us just your general view of, like, I guess Heiser kind of goes into this. You got Hasatan, and like, is that the same thing as Satan? Can you give us just really quick overview of like what you think Satan is in the Old Testament?
Yeah, so we get in the Old Testament. I mean, a lot of people will go straight to Genesis 3 with the serpent, but Satan is never in the Old Testament connected necessarily to the serpent. We get that connection in the New Testament, but if you're just looking at the Hebrew Bible, you don't necessarily get that connection. But the first time that he shows up is Job. You have in Job, you have Hasatan show up, the accuser, in God's counsel there. Um, and then when you get into the intertestamental data, you got a whole lot of Satan's. But really, the when you get to that word itself, it shows up 27 times in the Bible, and there are about 17 verses that it appears with what's called the definite article, the ha before it. So it means the or a. And so I wouldn't call you the Zach or a Zach. I wouldn't call myself the Matt, though we do have the Donald for Donald Trump, but we we don't have that this. So it's referring more to something that's a function, more functional in nature when it's describing that word, of the function of accusing, the function of being an adversary, someone who comes against. We also have, so that was um, 19 occurrences have that before it of the 27. The other 10 don't, but in those other 10 occurrences, you never have that word as a proper name. It's always a function there too. So the entire view of the Old Testament, when you have that word Satan or Hasatan, it's always a function and never a proper name.
Interesting. And of course, there's a couple there that are a little bit more debated, and we'll talk about those
Mhm.
today.
Yeah.
So, everyone sees, uh, Job as, the guy that I guess got tormented by Satan. Can you talk about, how we should see that figure in Job? I mean, do you think, you kind of already told us, but do you think that's Satan, like as we see it, or what is Satan in Job?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I'm not gonna discount that it could be, but, I just kinda like to go off of, alright, what does the data say? And instead of bringing in those things that we might learn in the future, as you keep reading, but
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell
Wait,
notifications.
they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
in Job 1 and 2, I don't think we necessarily see this Satan accuser, adversary figure as necessarily evil. Um, it seems that he's playing a role as almost like a prosecuting attorney or something in God's divine counsel, is the way that I see it. So God calls the sons of God to this. It seems like this big staff meeting, and he brings up his servant Job. Says, "Have you seen my servant Job?" And the Satan, the accuser, steps forward and says, "Well, basically, Job's playing the system." He's like, "You've got this retribution system, policy that the bad people get bad things and the good guys get good things, and the only reason that Job is doing this is because you blessed him so much. He's being righteous because he keeps getting stuff from you." And so he says, if you basically take everything away, then he's going to curse you to your face, um, and thus demonstrate that the policy is flawed. And so that's kind of the way I see the Satan, and you don't see him much after that in in the whole letter of Job, the book of Job, too much. So yeah, it's not necessarily that the question that he asks is evil. We got to read this as wisdom literature, and in concert with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes too, because the three of those together are telling a full view of what wisdom is. And so you have to kind of look at it that way, that he might not be asking an evil question, but he's simply doing his job on the divine council, which is watching out for policies.
Yeah, so it seems like he's doing a job, but there's, I guess, yeah, it could be possible, but we
It
don't.
could be possible. I'm not denying that,
Yeah,
but like if you just look at the text, you kind of have to possibly read that into it to get evil intentions. I mean, yes, it's not good that Job's kids died and everything was taken away and the permission there, but the question initially when he just asks about Job isn't necessarily evil in and of itself.
yeah, and it's
Now
and once
John
again,
Walton
mhm.
gets like big into this if you've ever read any of his stuff on Job, and he presents a ton of evidence for why he thinks it is, and it's pretty compelling.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know he took that view.
He has a whole commentary on Job. Also in his Demons and Spirits book, he gets into this, and he's got a YouTube channel where he goes like chapter by chapter. He's got like 30 videos on short videos on Job, which are all really good. If you want to
Yeah,
dig more into that, check out Walton.
yeah, totally. Okay, so next passage, Zechariah 3, 1 to 2, Numbers 22, 22, 2 Samuel 26, 19, 1 Chronicles 21, 1, Psalm 1 and 9. Can you tell us just how that word is used? The Satan, how is that
Those,
used in that passage? Those passages.
yeah, yeah. So let's check out. let's go to Zechariah first, Zechariah 3 verses 1 and 2. So we see the Lord relenting from judgment when it comes to an unfit high priest, this high priest, his name's Joshua. So Joshua comes before the Lord, and um, uh, it says a Satan accuses him. And so the Lord rebukes this accuser in Zechariah 3:2. He removes Zechariah's unclean garments. He forgives his sins. That's Zechariah 3:4. And but we don't see necessarily that the Satan is opposed to the Lord's will, or whether he's just functioning as a instrument of God's judgment. um, similarly to the angel of the Lord, Numbers 22:22, in the story of Balaam, when Balaam's donkey stops because the angel of the Lord is standing to, and when the angel of the Lord is there, he is called a Satan, an accuser, or an adversary. He's coming against Balaam. And so it can be simply just used that way of somebody who comes against another person. Now, we wouldn't say that the angel of the Lord is Satan, would we? Not necessarily. Um, And then you also have the context of 2 Samuel 26:19, and you compare it to 1 Chronicles 21:1, where Yahweh in 2 Samuel incites David to take the a census, and you compare that to uh, Hasatan uh, doing it, or Satan doing it in 1 Chronicles 21. And so you can say that, well, if you want to make those a parallel, then maybe God is a Satan there, which we wouldn't say that either, right? The angel of the Lord and God both aren't. So really, we get back to that thing about this in Zechariah, about this priest Joshua, the presence of an accuser isn't a great situation for him, but it doesn't mean that that accuser is immoral or opposed to God. He might just be doing his job and watching out for sacred space, and an unfit high priest coming in, But the Lord just says, hey, I'm going to forgive this guy. I'm going to give him clean robes. And the Satan, though he accused him, leaves at that point. He's done his job, and the Lord said, all right, well, I'm going to let this one, I'm going to turn this one around. And so that's kind of what we have in the Zechariah passage, rather than it being the big bad guy, Satan. There, it could just be the prosecuting attorney on God's council doing his job. So you brought up Psalm 109. We got verses 4-6 there. It has another interesting reference to that word Satan and how it's used. So what we have there, the psalmist asked the Lord to appoint an accuser to stand against his enemies, a Satan to stand against enemies. So it says this there, in return for my friendship, they accuse, Satan, me, appoint someone to oppose my enemy. Let an accuser, Satan, stand at his right hand. And when he is tried, let him be found guilty. So this right here could be a spiritual being, Satan, or just somebody who's an adversary against the Lord, David's enemy. We don't know. We just say that, similar to the angel of the Lord standing in the way of Balaam, or God maybe, or it could have been Satan inciting the census. It's just somebody who opposes them. So kind of all of this, there's no indication that, like, this Satan character in any of these relishes the chance to accuse Joshua, or has an intention of anything other, opposed to the will of God. We just see that it's just simply someone who stands in opposition to somebody else.
Yeah, so it seems like what you're saying is all these passages, they seem like we don't have any specific reason to think that it's like a personal name, Satan. And,
Yep.
We don't have anything in the grammar that specifically says it. And, it's possible, but all these different situations just happen to be in some type of adversarial role. So
Yeah.
it just makes more sense to think that, this seems to be this just type of adversary. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, I think I would say translating Satan in the Old Testament as adversary is or accuser is probably the best way to do it rather than like a capital S Satan. And a lot of translations are going that way for Job 1 and 2. You see more and more that they change it from Satan to an accuser or the adversary.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. So, I looked up Zechariah 3:1-2 in the NIV, and it says, and Satan with the capital S standing at his right
Mhm.
side to accuse him. The Lord said to
Yeah.
capital S Satan. So, if I heard you right, you said a Satan. So it seems like if you
Oh
say
yeah,
a
that
Satan,
one doesn't have the definite article in Zechariah, Numbers, or First Chronicles. Those ones don't have the definite article. Job has the definite article.
so maybe you think that the translator is just saying, hey, those don't have the definite article, so we're just gonna throw capital S Satan in there. Is that what it is there?
Some might be thinking that, and it's not to say that this wasn't him, but I think it's reading a bit into the text to assume that it is him because it's simply when you look at it, it doesn't seem like there's anything going on besides that role that we can see from Job of kind of the prosecuting attorney simply doing his job. You don't see Satan complaining that he doesn't get to, you know, kick Joshua out of the temple and take away his priesthood and all this type of stuff. He just simply leaves. He did his job.
That's interesting. And but even in the footnotes, it says Hebrew Satan means adversary, even though it
Yeah.
even though it capitalizes it as capital S Satan.
Mhm.
So that's
So,
interesting.
the issue is that if you make that Satan, then is the angel of the Lord, and God Satan then in Numbers and in First Chronicles, because it's the exact same word for those two.
Hmm. Yeah, and of course, that's when you get into like contradictions. It's like,
Yep. Hmm.
well, why not just why not just translate it like this? And it seems a lot make more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to Satan in Genesis 3. When he tempted Eve, do you think that's the devil?
The New Testament definitely makes that connection in Revelation. So we do have that connection there, but if we're just going by Old Testament data, then we don't necessarily have, I guess, the right to do that because you never see that word Satan or Hasatan come up there. Um, so a lot of people will try to like then bring in like, and we'll talk about probably Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 in a little bit to jump to that conclusion. But we don't even see the connection in terms of Nahash, which is the serpent, and Satan in any of those passages either. And so you don't have the connection there. So, uh, yeah, so what you have is the Nahash, basically. But the devil and Satan are connected to the serpent of old in what is it, Revelation 12, I think 7 verses 7 to 9 in the New Testament. So you do see that connection there, and I'm sure we'll get there as we go throughout our conversation today. In Second Temple Judaism, though, you do get a connection of this Nahash to the Satan figure or the original rebel, I like to call it more. In Wisdom of Solomon, I think it's chapter 2, and Psalms of Solomon, chapter 4. You do have those connections um, to a, a Satan, a bad guy who's I guess the leader of the other fallen spiritual beings.
Hmm. Uh, so if this is, a possible, you know, mention of Satan, can you talk about just like what description or details in this passage might give us more info about Satan in general?
Yeah. So like if you look at this, you have rather than Satan, the nahash, the serpent. So it's a Heiser calls a triple entendre. So it's a Hebrew word that the root of it has three different meanings. So the three consonants in it, which would be our English N or N, H, and S. Um, as a noun, it can mean a serpent, and you also see that in Numbers 21, verse 6 and verse 9. The verb of it is to foretell omens or to do divination or even to be shining. So to be shrewd, basically, or to shine. So you have that Deuteronomy 18:10, that word is used there, and First Chronicles 4:12 can mean it's the same thing as the bronze serpent, or um, Ir Nahash in First Chronicles 4:12. That city, the city of bronze, same come from the same root as this serpent. So it could be that the three things that it is it's a serpent, number one. Number two, it's one who performs divination or is shrewd, it could mean, and it's shining, a shining one. So in shining, often the connection to the stars or celestial beings was something that communicated that it was, rather than just your ordinary garden snake or something like that, that it's a spiritual being. Which also brings out the connection of, in Egypt, they had um, these serpents, seraphs, basically is what they called them, which were serpents with wings, and they were ones who both were associated with death and with wisdom. And so we have the serpent, his punishment is being cast down to the ground, to the Eretz, which also could mean the underworld, being a person of death. But these seraphs were they were throne room guardians, often depicted, like I said, serpents with wings, um, and so the Nahash, that's its original rebel, seems to be, when we make some connections with those passages in Ezekiel and Isaiah, we see like Eden as like this mountaintop garden, and in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, you had your divine council meetings of the gods up there. So it seemed like maybe this Nahash was either guarding the throne or part of the council and was then cast down.
Yeah, and I something I liked in the I guess your what is
Rough
a
draft.
good your rough draft of your dissertation so far is you mentioned how it'd be weird that God would have like this, divine rebel in his sacred space. Like that's supposed to be where, like, the paradise is. Like, why do you have a bad guy in there?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that makes a lot of sense. Like, if we have this creation and fall or something like that, where, if he's already a rebel at this point, it doesn't make sense why so at least if he fell, then he would have even had to fall from this or something after that.
Mhm.
Is
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah, and we see the spiritual beings continue to fall as you work through Genesis. I know you've been working through Genesis a ton in your podcast here, but yeah, as you continue to read through Genesis, you've got Genesis 3, and then you've got Genesis 6, and then you got Genesis 10 and 11, and it just keeps going, that you both have like these dual falls of both humanity and spiritual beings at the same time, going through like all of them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it does seem like you brought up that point that I I thought of, is like, why would God, um Job 1 and 2, Zechariah 3, allow um an adversary, somebody who is evil against him, into his council, his sacred space? Um to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense if he's cast out there in Genesis 3, um to crawl on his belly, so to say. And why why would um why would God keep allowing him back in? Uh, Like, a lot of people put Job pretty early. If you do take that this is the big bad guy as Satan, like, yeah, God calls him back in, but it doesn't necessarily. It could just be like, if this was the accuser on his divine council and he lost his job, maybe somebody else took the job. People have made that that connection as well. So, which might lead us when we get to the intertestamental period, you have multiple Satans.
That'll be fun to talk about. Okay, so
Yeah.
honorable mentions. These are, you mentioned these briefly: Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. I mean, those are possible mentions of Satan according to certain
Yeah.
people. Could you talk about your thoughts on those briefly?
Yeah. So Ezekiel 28 would be verses 1 to 19, and Isaiah 14 verses 12 to 15 talk about two kings. So the king of Babylon, king of Tyre. So, and it seems that there's some connections to the Garden of God, Eden, um, some kind of either spiritual being figure in there, or um, they're doing something that's paralleling these kings to something that happened in Eden in both of these texts. And so there's a debate of whether this is the Nahash, the original rebel, or connecting it with Adam. So there's a debate on two sides. Like, I believe Walton takes the Adam side of it. Heiser would take the other side, the that it's connected to Satan. I kind of go more with the Heiser thing, and the debate comes down to, especially in Ezekiel 28 verses 13 and 14, is the Masoretic text versus the Septuagint, and how they argue of you are an anointed guardian cherub, or I placed you with the cherub on the holy mountain. So, was Adam was placed into the garden, so people who lean more towards the Septuagint reading would take it as Adam. People who take the Masoretic text reading would see this as they're lining up these two kings, overlapping them with the Satan or the Nahash figure, the rebel in Eden. So it just depends on that. So I guess like we can go through like some of those texts. We have those two options, and um there's a bunch that I guess we could get into. Do you want me to just be quick on this, because I know we got a bunch of other stuff we need
Uh,
to go through, or do you want to dig in?
uh, I have no idea how long you think you can go.
Yeah, I don't know how quick I could do it. Well, a couple reasons that I would say that I think that it's a spiritual being is, I think the Adam option assumes things about Adam that aren't in the Genesis text, about that's overlapping with these kings, such as Adam being part of the divine council, or even wanting to be part of the Lord's assembly. It kind of assumes that the king wants this high role status type thing in there. Also, it never says that Adam is divine, but it talks about these kings assuming that they're like divine. It says humanity is made a little lower than Elohim, and when they eat of the tree, it says you'll be like God, but being like God doesn't mean you're the same as God. Or a spiritual being. So, another problem is the concern with the extreme pride of the king of Tyre, and we don't see extreme pride even in Adam when he's eating of the tree in the garden. So that's some of the reasons that I take. And there's no hint that he wanted to be above the stars of God, which is another thing in Ezekiel 28. We don't see that necessarily. So I do think it lends more based on a narrative reading to the spiritual beings, but I don't discount the Adam reading either. So I think the big thing of like all of the thing in Ezekiel 28 is Yahweh and the prophet announce judgment on Tyre there, and the prince of Tyre by connecting them to the divine rebel in Genesis 3. And there's kind of an overlap between, I think, the Prince of Tyre and Satan, which kind of points to the theme of, I would say, the Heiser calls it the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, or the divine council worldview, where it sees that there are hostile principalities and powers behind every nation that are animating them. And so I think that it plays more into the spiritual view there, whether that is the original rebel or some other spiritual being. That's kind of up for grabs. um Isaiah 14 has a lot of the exact same imagery connecting to, I believe, the rebel of Genesis 3, and the prophet draws on that similar story of rebellion for the king of Babylon there. And in Isaiah 14:4, it tells the prophet to take up a mashal. So a mashal there is sometimes translated as a taunt, but there's a lot of scholars who said that it's better translated as a comparative story. And so they're comparing that word mashal there in Isaiah 14:4 to um, basically this Babylon king to the original rebel who rebelled against God. And so they're kind of putting that context of um, overlapping them. So the Babylonian king is compared to a falling star from heaven, which is the language of the heavenly hosts. So it's making that connection there. He's called the morning star of the dawn, which should remind us of Job 38:7, when the morning stars shouted for joy as God created. So it's kind of making that connection there. So the judgment on the king of Babylon is similar to the judgment of the serpent in the garden. This king of Babylon is cast down from the mountain of God. And so you kind of get some overlap there of the nahash. And we do know that in the New Testament that um, those connections are made. And so, yes, we can go back and make those connections. But if you're just dealing simply with the Hebrew Bible and not assuming context from the New Testament, you don't really have a grounds to connect it to Satan, though it very well could be, looking back in retrospect.
So intertestamental period. Could you first explain what that is? Who wrote that? And let's start with. After you do that, let's start with first Enoch. The most popular one.
Yeah. So intertestamental period, basically, it's from when the temple is rebuilt, when they come back from exile in Babylon. You've got Zerubbabel's temple, and it goes all the way up until the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It's basically considered all the writings in that period. And yeah, First Enoch is probably the most popular, or at least the most heard of, um, in that. And there's different sections of it, which some people think were written by different people, and a lot of people don't like some of the later stuff in it. But basically, in Second Temple theology, especially Enochic theology, there are multiple, I guess you could say, multiple bad guys. You could say Satan's. Um, the leading example, like we said, comes from Enoch. So basically, he goes on this heavenly journey and sees millions of spiritual beings before the Lord, and that's in First Enoch, chapter 40, verse 1. So Enoch hears a series of four voices in that saying, and I heard the fourth voice fending off the Satans and forbidding them to come before the Lord of spirits to accuse those who dwell on the earth. So that's First Enoch 40, verse 7. So it seems we have multiple beings here performing either the office of Satan, or you kind of have this transition into Satan. It could just be that we have multiple accusers too. So it could just be that too. So let's keep going. If you keep going in Enoch, later in chapter 53, Enoch is shown what's called the angels of the plague. They're cooperating and they're preparing chains, basically the chains of Satan. So these angels of the plague are not good guys. They're so later after that in Enoch 53 verses 4-5, it communicates that all the kingdoms of the world are under the Satan's power and their chains, which is kind of interesting. So that's kind of where we get it to start in Enoch there, that you have these multiple Satans that are ruling. Basically, they have chains over the nations, over the kingdoms of the world. And that's kind of what we get. So when you get to First Enoch 54, it kind of gives a list of all of these Satans. So maybe I'll read some of that. It says Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Phaнаel. These are all the good guys. Sees them, the Satans, on that day and cast them into the fiery furnace that is blazing all day. And the Lord of Spirits may take vengeance on them on their account of their oppressive deeds which they performed as messengers of Satan, leading astray those who dwell upon the earth. So there, it seems like there is a singular Satan. Then maybe it's the group as a whole. Could be a singular of a whole. So, so some of the names that are mentioned earlier in that text are these Satans are called the armies of Azazel, and that's First Enoch 54. I think that's in verse 5. Are connecting these Satans there. So, um, and that that word messengers of Satan is an important image that connects kind of the Old and the New Testament. Vanderkam, he notes that the context here seems to identify Satan with Azazel, and perhaps the title reflects the identity of the Satan as the tempter, the chief demon, and is attested, and this is attested in the New Testament. So he thinks that right here is maybe one of the first instances of where it goes to the one singular bad guy, when they start making that shift to the from the many to the one. I see that could be possible. I mean, obviously, we see that there's. Well, we'll get to the New Testament stuff at the end of the episode here, but um, we definitely see one bad guy in the New Testament. But in the intertestamental period, you have a plethora of ideas when it comes to Satan, and a plethora of Satans.
Yeah, it's almost like you get outside the Bible and they're all over the place, and
Mm-hmm.
then
Yep.
it's like Satan everywhere.
Yep. Yeah. Um, so yeah, that word Azazel does show up in the Old Testament, though, that they use. So that's one name for Satan. In Leviticus 16 verses 8, 10, and 26, we have it as the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement, or the goat that goes away. And some, Heiser mentions this, that in the context of Leviticus, there you have a goat that's for Yahweh and a goat that's for Azazel, because there's two goats on the Day of Atonement. And so there's some that think that this goat is literally being sent to Azazel, not as a sacrifice, because obviously they don't sacrifice to demons, because Leviticus 17 verse 7, they're warned about no longer sacrificing to goat demons in the desert. So, which in basically in First Enoch, they make this connection of Azazel connected to a goat demon. Enoch 19 verse 1. They have that same connection there, which is they probably might have got that from Leviticus. But so yeah, so the wilderness was often associated with Azazel and demons, and that's kind of why we get Satan often depicted as a caricature of like having goat feet and stuff like that. Is the connection to Azazel.
It makes a lot of sense.
Because yeah, and so that's kind of it. So yeah, they use the word Azazel as one of Satan's names in the intertestamental period. He's associated with the realm of death, which is the wilderness. Israel was wandering in the wilderness at this time. They sent the goat on the Day of Atonement out into the wilderness, basically carrying the sins of the camp back to the realm of death where it belongs, to Satan, who's Satan, or the Azazel figure, who's in their minds kind of maybe the god of death or whatever, associated with death, at least the things of death in their world, in their worldview. There. So yeah, after sorry, you can go.
I was just going to ask, but the passage with Deuteronomy, that's like terribly unclear. Like there's a whole bunch of debate and scholarship of like what that is. Like
Yeah.
it's just like kind of out of nowhere. Like, oh, this one's to Azazel, and I guess maybe what you're thinking, or what most scholars think, is that they saw, oh, you have God, and then you have the other one for Azazel, so that must be a bad figure.
Yeah, they both have one that's for God, and the other one has that same word for before it, but it, for the scapegoat for, it says for Azazel. So some do think that it's being sent that way. There are other videos. We did a whole episode on the Day of Atonement in our we did an atonement series on Expedition 44 where Ryan, who's way better at explaining all the different views on this, does it. So if you're looking for multiple views, you can go look at our Day of Atonement episode on our channel, and yeah, he goes through pretty. We go pretty in depth on 3 different views on what the Azazel thing could mean.
And that offering or whatever, that
Hmm.
the scapegoat, that's a
Yeah.
I mean, some people say that it's like taking the sins like into the desert kind of thing. Is that
Yeah, I mean, some would say that the goat was a transportation device because often, like, they laid the hands on the head of the goat, and like some who are more into retributive views of it see them like putting the sins onto the goat and sending the goat off. Some see it as a vehicle. Laying on of hands in the Bible is setting someone apart for a task, is the way that I see it. Because you lay hands on to commission elders and people for ministry in the New Testament, you're not placing sins on them when you lay your hands on it. And often it's not always like you just the laying on of hands was setting something apart for a task or for a purpose, setting something apart for it. So to read the laying on of sins on it, yes, I think it was used to transport the unholiness of the camp, the uncleanness of the camp, and take it back to where it belonged. But just notice also the Azazel, the goat that went off, and the scapegoat, the goat that goes in the wilderness, doesn't get killed. I mean, yeah, it probably dies in the wilderness, but the goat that gets killed is the one that's blood is sprinkled around the sanctuary to cleanse it. The goat for Yahweh. The
oh
other one's just
interesting?
sent off.
Yeah. Hmm.
It doesn't get killed. So
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, let's keep going. What were you going to say next?
no, I was gonna go with kind of well, all of first Enoch, if we're still in Enoch and still looking at seeing Azazel and his rebellion and all of this connect to Genesis 6 1 to 4. It's basically all the beginning of first Enoch is all like a commentary on the sons of God and the daughters of men stuff. And Enoch 69 5 to basically starting in verse like 3, it talks about all of these um basically that they humans acquired occult knowledge from these fallen sons of God, and that's kind of the context that they give. So I'll just read a little bit here. First Enoch 69, starting in verse 3. These are the chiefs of their angels. So it's listing all these angels. Um, Before that, it lists kind of like the underlings in the text, and then it kind of has the chief of the bad guys here, and like their names. He's like the angels, their names, their centurions, their chiefs over 50, their chiefs over tens. The name of the first is Yacon. He is the one who misled the children of angels and brought them down on the earth to pervert by the daughters of all the people. The second is Asbel. He is the one who gave the children of the holy angels the evil counsel and misled them so that they would defile their bodies by the daughters of the people. The third is Gadriel. This one who showed the children of the people all of the blows of death, who misled Eve and showed the children of the people how to make instruments of death, such as shields, breastplates, swords, warfare, and all of the other instruments of death to the children of the people. So basically, here you have Azazel listed among the Satans in First Enoch 65:6, and they're responsible for the corruption of humanity. But something else to note here is Gaddarel is the one who deceives Eve. So if Azazel is the one who's connected to being Satan, it's not the one who deceives Eve in First Enoch. They're different.
Interesting. So it can't be that they're just going by different names.
It could be, because later in First Enoch 54, verses 4 to 6, it identifies Azazel as Satan and also the serpent. So there's a lot of scholars of First Enoch who notice in its demonology there's so many inconsistencies. But this was the reason we read it is because we want to know what's in the water, so that we can have a better mind, like get into their mind, so that we can interpret things. Because um, it was an influential book, and even in some canons of some of the early church writings, like the Ethiopian one, it's still part of their scripture canon, Ethiopian Bible.
Hmm. Yeah, so we don't necessarily know if Gadarel is, to them, is
Yeah,
Satan.
yeah. It seems like in the text here, it's different from Azazel, who is the most common one to point to being Satan in First Enoch, but it's not necessarily. Both of them, Gadrael and Azazel, are both connected to the serpent in First Enoch. Both of them are,
Hmm.
and they're
Interesting.
both connected to being Satan's. So you kind of do have a connection there in the Second Temple. That, all right, so you got like this mosaic of all these pieces, and we're trying to put them together. And it seems that the New Testament does a little bit of that more for us when eventually get there. But I think we got some other intertestamental stuff we need to work through before we get to New Testament.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk about Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah. All right. So Jubilees chapter 10 is kind of where I'd like to start. And so we see a post flood account here where Noah and his family are being targeted by evil spirits. So Noah prays, and God tells the archangel to bind 9/10 of the evil spirits and allow 1/10 to still remain on the earth, so that they may be subject to Satan. So that's kind of interesting. So 9/10 of all these evil spirits that are coming after the flood are bound up. Um, but then it calls the chief of these spirits. It calls this Satan, who chief of spirits, and it calls him Mastema, which is interesting. So we get the one of the first mentions of Satan being chief over other spiritual beings, the bad guys. So he's the big bad guy, the boss bad guy. And then we also have this word Mastema um, that's mentioned. So Azazel doesn't appear in the book of Jubilees. He's kind of the Satan figure in Enoch. Um, and he's associated with Satan in First Enoch. Mastema is not in Enoch, but it's the Satan figure in Jubilees. So we kind of have a changing of name, but similar type worldview going on of what this character is. It's over spirits. It's one of the chief ones. We do see multiple in First Enoch, but we don't see so much of that in Jubilees. We kind of have gotten to this point where there's one guy now. So Mastema, really, it's a noun, which Vanderkam, again, he says it's a noun which emerged as a name or a title at a later time. It's found twice in the Hebrew Bible, in Hosea 9, 7, and 8, where it means animosity or hostility. And the phrase Prince of Mastema in Jubilees clearly communicates an individual who bears that title, while Mastema alone seems to have become a name. So Jubilees 10, verse 11, in the context implies that he is identified with the Satan, and it seems he is the counterpart to the angel of the presence, so the opposite of the angel of the presence. So that's kind of a Vanderkam says about that text there. It's also interesting when you get to Jubilees chapter 3. If you go back a little bit, you got the fall story. So the garden there, but we don't see Mastema connected to the serpent. Jubilees has a serpent, but it's not Mastema. It's not their Satan figure in Jubilees. It's two
But
different
it's
entities.
just the serpent, right? It doesn't actually name
Yeah,
it.
it's just a serpent. Yeah, it's not named. Yeah. So, but it's not Mastema. So the
Very
Satan
interesting.
figure. Yeah. So we do know that Mastema is the lord over the Watchers or the demons, but they don't associate him with the serpent. We do have then also in Second Temple literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Pseudepigrapha, we got the figure Belial, however you want to pronounce it. I've heard it pronounced 100 different ways. So Belial or Belial doesn't appear as a proper name for Satan in some of the pseudepigrapha, but it kind of does in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's kind of another one of those things that it it is something that shifts a little bit, I guess you could say.
Like Satan and Satan.
Yep, yep. It becomes almost a proper name as you go on, or is used that. So some of the ways that this Belial, he shows up one time in the New Testament too, in 2 Corinthians 6:15. That name. So you got that too. So Belial is the most common name for the Prince of Darkness in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Pseudepigrapha. Some of the ways that it describes him is he is called the angel of wickedness and the ruler of this world in the martyrdom of Isaiah. He is the head of the demonic powers, also in the martyrdom of Isaiah. His law and will are set against the law and the will of the Lord in the Testament of Naphtali. His way is one of darkness and opposed to light in the Testament of Levi and the Testament of Joshua. Belial's angels are set against the angels of the Lord in the Testament of Asher. He is the master of the spirits of error in the Testament of Judah, the Testament of Zebulun, the Testament of Levi. Um, and the spirit, he's the spirit of error, which is against the spirit of truth in Testament of Judah. He's called the angel of enmity in the CD scroll and the war scroll of Qumran. He is the prince of the kingdom of wickedness in 1QM scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's the head of the forces of darkness and often called the army of the troops or the army of the lot of Belial, um, who are against the sons of light, which are the lot of God. And that's in the war scroll also in from Qumran. And all of the spirits of his lot and the angels of destruction walk according to the precepts of darkness towards them, and their desire is destruction. That's 1QM also. So they've got, I could keep going and going, like when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because it seems like every other page Belial's there.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and what about Wisdom 224 and Dead Sea Scrolls? Do they help us at all with determining Satan as the devil?
Yeah. So throughout the Second Temple, it doesn't always connect Satan, Azazel, Mastema, Belial with the serpent of Genesis 3, but they usually connect them to the leader of the fallen sons of God from Genesis 6 more often. And we kind of see in Wisdom of Solomon that by the envy of the devil, death entered into the world, and those who belong to his realm experience it. So that's Wisdom 224 there that you mentioned. So Saki, he's a commentator, he notes that even in the book of Wisdom, the serpent is never named. The affirmation that God did not create death and that it entered the world only by the work of the devil can be explained by thinking of a reference of the Eden story and the disobedience of Adam. In the book of Wisdom, the devil remains only as the cause of death, which is evil par excellence. So it connects. Yeah. So he says in the book of Wisdom, it doesn't name the serpent, though the devil is present. But in that book, the devil is the one that's responsible for the cause of death.
Yeah, I mean, I read it and I wasn't terribly clear because I guess you could have the devil, like, maybe the serpent is like, I don't know, some type of minion or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, the devil is in charge, but then you have the serpent, and maybe that just complicates things unnecessarily. Or,
Maybe.
but of course, you also have the devil. A lot of people say that, Satan was like controlling like a serpent or a snake or whatever, possessing it.
Yeah, I
Any
take more of the
thoughts?
spiritual being. I take more of the spiritual being aspect of it, just because of the kind of the triple entendre that we talked about, and um, the whole connection to like seraphs and the Egyptian background of snakes with wings and all of that that were connected to both to death and to wisdom. And you have one of um, the words for nahash, one of those three meanings, basically being shrewdness, which is connected to wisdom all throughout Proverbs.
Yeah, true. So, I mean, does the text and the one you just quoted, like, does that? I guess is it vague, or I mean, do you think that's like actually referring to the devil as the serpent?
Um, I think it's just vague, but I think that you could make those connections. It doesn't necessarily name it, but you do have in wisdom like death connected to the devil, and you have death coming through the serpent, so you can kind of make that connection.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes
So
sense. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I mean, so I was just curious, like, it seems in the Old Testament. I mean, you kind of already told us your views, but it seems like
Mhm.
you have a whole bunch of mentions of Satan, where he's being some type of adversary, but
Mhm.
there isn't a lot of reasons to think that it's some type of like, or like definitely not like maybe I'd say no reason to think that it's some figure that's in charge of a bunch of different little demons or
Yeah, you
whatever.
don't get it at all just off the Hebrew Bible. If all you took was our books of the Hebrew Bible, it'd be really hard to come to that conclusion without New Testament data and
Yeah,
intertestamental data.
yeah, which is weird because it's like, well, if you have one text, and I mean, you don't think that the this extra intertestamental period data is inspired, then it's
Yeah.
like, are they commenting on it and just, I guess, taking it out of context? Um, maybe could you possibly talk about like just differing views that scholars have held that you've heard of, but that try to explain why or what they're doing here?
Yeah, so in like with connecting the Second Temple texts and the Hebrew Bible texts, um, so when they see the three falls that we have in Genesis, and so Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, so or 10, 11, Tower of Babel, they see that if you take a Deuteronomy 32 worldview, divine council worldview of a spiritual God disinheriting the nations and then calling Abraham and putting a spiritual being over them. Connect Psalm 82 in there, and that then they see that these spiritual beings kind of logically need someone organizing them, and so that's kind of where that they think a lot of scholars think that that idea came along is they're trying to work through these things in the second temple. Yes, like you said, that these aren't inspired scripture, but they do give us data points of how people thought, and some of those things, it's almost like the New Testament and Old Testament do have overlapping but also diverging concepts when it comes to the second temple. So in the Old Testament, we don't really have any evil spirit referred to as Satan. We have accusers, and they might be evil, they might not be, but uh, the New Testament doesn't point to multiple Satans like the intertestamental period had. Um, it only knows one devil, one Satan, one serpent. Yet the New Testament does describe Satan as having authority over other divine rebels and the powers of darkness. The New Testament talks about that, and it talks about the Satan in the New Testament having a kingdom, an army, ruling the world. Um, the devil in the fire of hell being made for the devil and his angels in Matthew 25, and that. So it seems to have people. He's got his people. So these details basically weren't present in the Old Testament, but some of those statements are consistent with First Enoch and other Second Temple Jewish texts. First Enoch describes the fiery end to Azazel and his armies, and we kind of see that data in the New Testament. Um, we also see that there was no single unified presentation of Satan in the Second Temple period, but we also see that the Satan or the devil of the New Testament is kind of a mosaic of all those ideas that you find in Second Temple. So they're kind of put together. So the particulars that we can take away, I guess, of the New Testament and Second Temple thing is that there's a divine rebel who's opposed to Yahweh and his ways. He wants to corrupt the human imagers. We kind of see that, and that he has a kingdom that's kind of antithetical to God's kingdom. It's in opposition to it. And so there's this two kingdoms type battle going on. And we had that um, both in the Old Testament, in the Intertestament, and the New Testament. So those are kind of the ideas that I think that go those three things of the divine rebels opposed to Yahweh. He wants to corrupt human imagers, and his kingdom is opposite of God's kingdom.
Yeah, yeah. I can't help but also think about how, like, you have Genesis 6, you have Deuteronomy 32, Tower of
Yep.
Babel.
Yep.
Depending on your view of that, it's going to depend on what those mean exactly. But we know
Yeah.
that in Enoch, they have this. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, at least the Heiser, at least that that we have this background of the Apkallu and what's the Book of the Giants, I think it's called, where they're pulling from their own worldview, and technically, they are the closest commentaries we have on the Genesis 6 passage. So, maybe if you take a view that Genesis 6 was, at least compiled in the Babylonian time period when Israel was there, then that makes a lot of sense. Why that would also be the background context for the Book of Enoch, and maybe they're the same context, maybe they're talking about the same thing, and then in that case, we could make the argument that the devil is Satan. The devil might have been in charge of the sons of God. All these other different passages, which of course you also have other people that think the sons of God passage is written a lot earlier, and then it's like, well, maybe the Book of Enoch's wrong, and maybe they're bringing their own context into it when that's not actually the original passage, and all this other different stuff. So,
yeah, and in Enoch, there are a lot of contradictions between the early chapters and the late chapters, and I think some people think that multiple people wrote it, because some people would call it first, second, third Enoch, all that stuff, like the divisions in it. But yeah, it's all kind of a commentary, like you said, on Genesis chapter 6 more than Genesis chapter 3 in Enoch.
Yeah. It's just interesting to think about, like, what's influencing what, and then maybe that is the original context, anyways.
At least they interpret it that way.
So
the Bible in the New Testament runs with some of it. I mean, you got Jude quoting Enoch. You've got some allusions to some of that imagery in Jude and Second Peter and stuff like that. And there's other allusions throughout the New Testament. It doesn't mean that they're. I say that, like, like Jude, when he uses it, I mean, it would just be like me if I was preaching, quoting from C.S. Lewis or something like that. It doesn't mean that I affirm everything that C.S. Lewis believed, but I love C.S. Lewis, but I'm just using a point that he made that was true and supports my argument for what I'm teaching.
Yeah. But I'm open to the idea that some beliefs in the New Testament that they wrote about weren't actually true. I mean, you have that you have the idea of I can't remember what passage it is, but the rock that apparently followed Moses, that
I think it's 1 Corinthians 10 or something like that.
Where the water is coming from the rock, and like it's almost like flying or something following Moses as they walk, but we find that in the intertestamental period, and we obviously that's not true.
They had to try to explain why the rock kept being with them.
Yeah,
wherever they
right.
went. I mean, all right, we were here and then here and then here, and the rock is still with them in all these chapters. So is the rock going with them, or is there a new rock each time? And they were like, oh, the rock was with them. And Paul flips that and says the rock was Christ, talking about Christ's presence and the the blessings that come with that that follow you all the days of your life. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
also Jonas and Jambres, we don't think that
Hmm.
they're,
Yeah.
obviously they were historical. Well, I guess depend on your view of the Exodus and all that, but
Yeah.
you know, they probably thought they were historical, but they definitely weren't the names that we have in the Bible. And the only way you can get that is from the intertestamental period when they're written,
Hmm.
written way later than the Old Testament. So it's
Yeah.
a yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm open to the idea.
Me too.
I'm definitely not committed on any view of the sons of God or anything like that. Um,
No. Yeah. Yeah, in my dissertation, I'm just kind of trying to put down all the data, and then
right.
come to something that makes sense. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, and one view that I found really interesting was on Michael Heiser's podcast. He had Dr. Archie Wright, where he talked about
Mhm.
how he thinks that the people in the intertestamental period, they're going through like these really difficult times, and they're trying to explain how we got evil, and it just makes
Mhm.
sense because you have the
Yep.
serpent, and then you have the sons of God, and
Yep.
that appears to be a place where evil could have came from. So it must have been there because that's the evil that we see in the Old Testament, and
Yeah.
then they're kind
Yeah,
of
and you have it
yeah,
in Enoch. I read the text earlier of this angel. It was the one with Gadriel, who's the one who is connected in
of the
First
serpent.
Enoch to the serpent. Yep, and tempting Eve. But in that passage, if you notice if you go back and listen when I read that, it's saying what they all taught mankind, and they attribute the evil of humanity not just to Adam's sin, but each time that it was the whole thing behind Genesis 6 is in the Babylonian context is the Apkallu taught forbidden knowledge, which the Babylonians thought was good and used it to build empires and go to war and all this. And it's a polemic in First Enoch against Babylonian culture, which all that stuff is actually evil.
Yeah. Um, so I'm curious. You know, well, let's what does this say about the devil? Yeah. So, did you have any extra thoughts about the New Testament that you wanted to add?
Yeah, so the word devil, I mean, is the Greek word for adversary, which the same thing as Satan in Hebrew, basically. So you got that. Revelation 12, 7 to 9 connects Satan and the devil as the same person, basically, to the serpent in Genesis 3. So you have that connection there, Revelation 12. You see in Luke 10:18 Jesus, when the demons are going and getting cast out by the disciples, he said, I saw Satan fall like lightning, which some have said, all right, was that when Satan was kicked out of heaven? I'm like, I think he was kicked out before then, or kicked out of the throne room. I think Jesus might there be using Satan as a singular of the whole, that he sees, since the demons are being cast out and the enemies getting defeated. He's like, I saw him fall like lightning, and echoing back maybe to when he actually was thrown out. So that's my take on it. You got Matthew 4 and the temptation in the wilderness, where um, the devil is tempting him. Jesus is taking on the story of Israel there, and the temptations where basically Israel failed at in the wilderness. Um, Jesus overcomes them. Especially, it's interesting that the devil offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, and Jesus doesn't deny that he owns them, which plays into the whole Deuteronomy 32 sons of God um, type of view. Because he doesn't say no, you don't own them, but he says to worship and serve your God alone, which is basically having political power doesn't um, isn't worshiping God, basically. So then you got a whole bunch of other things in the New Testament, names for Satan. You got besides the devil, you got the ruler of the power of the air in Ephesians 2:2. You've got the god of this world, Second Corinthians 4:4. You got the one who has the power of death in that was defeated in Hebrews 2:14. The great dragon in Revelation 12. Belair, and we talked about that, Second Corinthians 6:15. So you got that connection. The evil one, you got the tempter in First Thessalonians chapter 3. Um, so you got the accuser of the brethren in Revelation, also the ones who accuse Jesus' brothers and sisters. You got the father of lies in John 8:44. You got Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons, in Matthew 12. So those are just some of the ways that they basically um, refer to the evil one, the rebel. You do see the connection that it seems that like I said earlier, Matthew chapter 25, that the the fire of Gehenna is reserved for the devil and his angels. So it seems like he has he has a crew that he's in charge of. So you do have those connections throughout the New Testament, and you see that the devil, the beast, the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation chapter 20, which is a connection. It could be a connection to Enoch, where all the Satans get thrown into the fiery lake in Enoch.
But we don't really. Yeah, I guess where are they getting that from? Because they don't have the revelation to get that
Yeah,
that idea from, like say that today, if we're looking at the Bible, we can
yeah,
make commentary on the New Testament because we're like, hey, this is inspired, we know it's
mhm,
true, kind of thing. And that's we can make these connections with the Old Testament. They didn't have the people in the second intertestamental period, they didn't have that. So I mean, do we see that anything in the Old Testament?
of the devil being thrown into
Yeah.
being destroyed. Well, you do have the proto-evangelion. So the seed of the woman will crush the head of the snake. I mean, that's all that you got.
That's an interesting, huh? I didn't think about that in advance. That's interesting. Um, so I mean, you talked about the New Testament. Um, I mean, in your eyes, like as a Christian, like you want the New Testament, you want to say it's inspired. You said you're okay with maybe if they have beliefs that are kind of being influenced by the culture, but it's not necessarily true. Do
Yeah.
you what views have you heard that Christians take, I guess, kind of maybe to, I don't know, reconcile the idea that somehow we go from basically no Satan, or maybe bits and pieces of Satan, to a full-on Satan, and then full-on Satan where we kind of see it today. So how do you what views have you seen that that track the developmental of the idea of Satan?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opinion and scholarship on it. Some don't even believe that spiritual beings are real. They see it more as neurology and um, different and diseases and stuff like that. John Walton would be more in that camp. You've got who is it? I'm blanking on his name. Walter Wink, is it? I think him. But then you got other guys like Arnold and Heiser and ones who some would hold the progressive revelation, even though that they wouldn't call the intertestamental stuff inspired. Is that, and I think some of it was pulled from their cultural river. Um, but I think we just, for me, it's like I go with, all right, what did Jesus affirm? Because if if he is our, if he's the word of God, we should listen to him. Like at the Transfiguration, like the God says, "This is my beloved son. Listen to him." And so if he if he met with a devil in the wilderness, if he saw Satan cast down from heaven, I'm like, I think I can trust Jesus. And that's kind of where I go. I'm not it doesn't bother me if like you said before, if like some of that stuff seeped in and maybe it was true, you know? It doesn't make or break the game, I guess you could say. We do know that there was an original rebel in the beginning, whether that's Satan or there were many Satans or what. It doesn't make a difference because we know that the end game is that God wins. So whether it's a literal Satan or if it's something, not I mean something within us or diseases or whatever, that whole type of view, of this is just people in an ancient culture with non-modern minds or whatever who are just acting in their culture, which I don't know, personally don't like that view. I do take more of the supernatural view. It's just as modernists we try to downplay all the supernatural so much,
Sure.
and so that's kind of at least where my sentiments lie, is that, and plus I come from a more Pentecostal tradition and we like our Satan. So
You have to declare to Satan, and he'll listen.
yeah. Yeah, no. There's yeah. So that's kind of where I land. I guess you could say I'm indifferent and it doesn't make me upset to dive into some of the different points of view on it. The like I said, the things that we do have attributed that can connect the data points between the Old Testament, the Intertestament, and the New Testament were the kind of the things that I listed before, that we do see that there was an original rebel who's opposed to God, that this rebel wants to distort humanity, and that God is going to win, and that he has a kingdom that is antithetical against hostile toward the kingdom of God. We just need to make sure we're walking in his kingdom and not in Satan's kingdom.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Uh, I was listening to John Walton earlier, his Demons and Spirits book, because
Cool.
as you mentioned, like he takes a very like
Yeah.
it's the culture, that's just because it's in the
Yeah.
Bible doesn't mean it's you know
Hmm.
not it's not inspired, but it doesn't mean that we
Yeah.
as Christians need to believe that. Um, you
Hmm.
know, it was interesting. I mean, I'm really interested to interview him on it because he's thinking like his I guess his idea is as if there's anything that his rule is that if there's anything in the culture that they couldn't have received from someone else, then it's probably from someone else. But if there's something that they couldn't
Hmm.
have seen from the other culture, then that's when we can be confident it was like that part was inspired or whatever.
Inspired.
I
Yeah.
probably messed up his view there, but what
No,
it's
I
like,
read that book and
yeah,
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't agree with all of it, but I really enjoyed his point of view on it, and he made a lot of really good points that made sense. But yeah, he does tend to go towards demythologizing a lot of it. I guess you'd say, not myth in a bad way, but taking the supernatural out of it,
yeah,
which
which is
I
hilarious
mean,
because
it is, yeah.
I mean, of course, Heiser ripped it apart or attempted to,
Yep.
you know,
Yeah, he
uh,
did like a two-part podcast on it as a response,
he
I
didn't like
think.
that.
He didn't, and that's what scholars, I guess, do to each other. But
Yeah, it's funny. Like Walton, I didn't know that before Heiser came out with that podcast. I didn't even know the book existed. Where Walton's
mhm.
almost kind of demythologizing, and then Heiser's like the complete opposite of like everything is supernatural, the unseen
Yep,
realm.
everything. Yeah, uh-huh. Yep. And I do like Heiser a lot, and I love Walton too. I mean, I've learned and grown so much from both of their work. and both their work on this topic. And
Yeah.
so I appreciate both of them and their contributions to the study of the supernatural.
Nice. Well, now that we can end on a warm note.
Yeah.
Any extra thoughts you wanted to add there before we head off?
No, not necessarily. We got through quite a bit of that. No, I just think that there's a little bit of danger, I think, in demythologizing it, because it if we don't see like whether it's Satan as a real somebody or a a real force, we have the tendency to like not see the distinctions between the kingdoms of the world and the kingdom of God.
Hmm.
And so that would be kind of my closing, I guess, plea or or perspective of we do really see, and we see it all throughout the early church, even after the New Testament, this language. And that's big part of my dissertation, is looking at this two kingdoms mindset that flows through the entire Old Testament, New Testament, intertestament, and early church, and that
Yeah.
there's a very distinct thing between the principalities and powers, or you can throw Satan into that, and the kingdom of God, Jesus's kingdom.
Hmm. Yeah, and a lot more of that on your guys' YouTube channels.
Yeah,
Everyone go check that out.
that is a big mantra of ours, as we talk about that a lot.
But also, I'm excited for your dissertation when you finish that, because that's some
Yeah,
interesting ground you're going to be covering there in the New Testament.
yeah, I'm excited to get cracking on that. I've just started it, so yeah,
Nice. So one more thing that I wanted to add was in the Heiser's view, where we see this shift and like how that makes any sense is, in all actuality, everything that we see in the New Testament, it makes sense. Like we could have gotten that from the Old Testament, so that even if they have that cultural background behind them, the writers of the New
continuity.
Testament, it like they could have said, hey, some of this is true, some of this we get from the Bible, from the Old Testament, and the rest of it they could have just thrown it out. But I mean, in some regards, it does make a little bit of sense to say that we definitely see a little bit of it in the Old Testament. Whether you can make that connections from it just alone, I don't know, and maybe they're, depending on your view of inspiration, you can be confident in saying like, oh, that's not actually true. That Satan isn't actually the serpent. Satan isn't one of the sons of God or something like that. But I guess everyone comment in the description or the chat or whatever of what your thoughts are.
What do you think?
Yeah. All right. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for coming on here. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Any place you have YouTube, you have you and Ryan's website. Anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, expedition44.com is our website. We got blogs and stuff on there. You can look up Expedition 44 on YouTube, any of your favorite podcast apps. We're on Facebook also, if you want to chat with us.
Oh, shoot.
Yep. So that's about it. Thanks for having
Awesome.
me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation, Zach, and appreciate you, man.
Yeah, awesome. Appreciate you too, man. I hope you have a great rest of your night.
You too.